I think there's some important information in this one that needs to be added or corrected, so hang on to your seats on this one. There are 7 slides in this section. First of all, let's talk about these two items here, the boot volume and the system volume. In these cases, by volume, we're not talking about a hard drive itself, not the physical drive, but we're talking about partitions. And so let's understand what the boot partition and the system partition are. So the boot partition is where the Windows folder is. This is where the Windows system is located. And then the system volume or the system partition is a special little, it's actually a fairly small little partition where the boot information is needed in order to load the Windows operating system. Let's take a look at them. I'm going to call up my disk manager, my disk management window here. And if I go down to my C drive, right here, you'll see this partition, the C drive. That is my boot partition. Here you see the boot volume or the boot partition, which is where the Windows folder is, right, on my C drive, which we could see if we went to my C drive. C and Windows. So that's my Windows folder. So that is the boot partition. Now, it sounds like that would be the partition that you would use to boot to it, but that's not. That would be the system partition. The system partition is this little 100 megabyte file right here, and you can see it says EFI system partition, and that is that little partition that is used, as we saw here, excuse me, to find and load the Windows OS. So that's where those are. Now, this one is created automatically as you install Windows, or at least since Windows 2008, it's loaded automatically. It's not assigned a drive letter, so you can't see it in File Explorer, but you can see it if you call up your disk manager. All right, let's go on then to the next one. Now, this one requires some correction, so pay very close attention on this slide. Basic disks, we've already talked about basic disks a little bit on the previous slide or on the previous video. Volumes on basic disks are called partitions. So again, let's take a look here. Each of these is a partition. And this is a basic disk, as you can see. Now, this, as opposed to a dynamic disk, a basic disk can have partitions, and it can be partitioned into different drive letters. If I wanted to, I could make 2 or 3 different partitions with 2 or 3 different drive letters. They don't have to have drive letters. That is to say, I can make a partition without a drive letter, but I can have multiple partitions and multiple drive letters on a basic disk. All right, so they're called partitions. Now, as soon as I turn this into a dynamic disk, if I were to right-click on here, convert this to a dynamic disk, these are no longer called partitions. They are now called volumes. And so when you use the term volume, you're referring to a dynamic disk, not to a basic disk. And you're referring to the individual, if you want to call them partitions, but they are now volumes. And a volume on a dynamic disk can span multiple physical disks, whereas a partition can only be on a single basic disk. Now, this stuff here is where the misinformation is. What we're talking about right here is only on the older style of partitioning, the MBR style of partitioning, which was only true on the old BIOS type machines, not on the UEFI machines. So when we had the old MBR style of partitioning on BIOS, on the old BIOS machines that had the battery operated BIOS chip on the motherboard, that's when this was true, that you could make up to 3 primary partitions on a disk, and then you could make an extended partition, and then you could divide that extended partition into additional logical partitions. So if I wanted to have, say, 6 partitions on a disk, I could make 3 primary partitions and then 1 extended partition, and then I would divide that extended partition into 3 more logical partitions, and that would give me 6 partitions. That is no longer true with the newer UEFI type of drive, the GPT partitioning system on a UEFI type of system. With those, you don't have primary and extended partitions. They're all equivalent to primary partitions, and you can have up to 128 of them without having to do this trick with the extended partitions. So with the new GPT style, and maybe I should write this in here. There. With the new GPT, I can have 128, I'll call them primary, even though they're not really called that, up to 128 primary partitions. They're just called partitions, but anyway, up to 128 primary partitions. This system over here is the MBR, and on the MBR, this whole MBR system is, we're on the old BIOS style systems, and these over here are on the newer UEFI systems. In other words, this is the chip that is on the motherboard. These had a BIOS chip, and now we have the UEFI chip, which is a flash memory style chip rather than the old CMOS type of chip that required a battery. All right, I hope that that's a little bit clear and clarified a few things. Now, dynamic disks can hold up to 128 volumes. Now, don't get this confused with what I was talking about a moment ago, because the number 128 came up twice here. In this case, we're talking about dynamic disks that are on, they could be on either system. That is to say, the old MBR type or the GPT type of partitioning. If I change from basic to dynamic, those can hold 128 volumes. However, if with the GPT partitioning system, I can put 128 volumes on those, whether they are basic or dynamic. So be careful about not confusing those two. They're both 128 volumes. Dynamic disks on either system, or any disk on GPT systems can hold 128 volumes. On dynamic disks, though, we can hold multiple, we can span multiple disks, we can configure RAID, we can do striping, and then we can convert. And I showed you how we can convert earlier. I go over to this side where I'm working with the whole disk, right click, and I can convert to dynamic disk. Virtual hard drives is a file that we can create that looks like a different drive. Now, where can I do that? I'm going to go back to disk management, and I'll just click the E drive here, and I'm going to go up to action, and here I have create VHD. Okay, so I'll click create VHD, and I can tell it where I want to put it. Let's say I want to put it on my E drive, right? And I'll give it a name, right? And I'll say my virtual drive, and it'll end in VHD, right? And I'll tell it what size I want it. I'm not going to actually create this, by the way, right now, but I could tell it exactly how big I want it to be. Let's say that I want it to be 500 gigabytes. And I'll use the newer style, the VHDX. Because I can set. You can see here that I can the size limits of the older style and the newer style, but I'll choose the newer style, and I will also choose dynamically expanding, which means it will only actually be the size that I need to hold the data I have in it, and it will expand as I need it to expand to hold the data that I want. And then I would click OK, and it would actually create a file on this disk that looks like its own drive. Right? So that's a virtual drive. Now, after I create that, I also have to attach it. So I can go back to action, and I can attach that. And now it will show up in my disk manager as though it's another drive. Okay? So I could actually create, let's say, what do I not have here? E, F, G. So let's say an F. No, I have an F. I have an F, G, and H on my CD-ROM. So maybe an I drive, right? So I could create an I drive here, and it actually is just a file on my E drive. So that's a virtual drive. Storage spaces I've talked about. Storage spaces was introduced in Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012 and allows us to create storage pools, which is a collection of physical disks that then we can provision out from that different spaces or different disks that look like partitions on our drive, to our computer. So again, we would do that from settings. I'll just type storage spaces, and this is where we create it. This is where I would actually manage the partitioning of those storage spaces. From this is where I create the pool, and then this is where I would partition out that pool into different drives. Right? So that is that's storage spaces, and you have that available to you. It would be fun to play with, and one of these days I'm actually going to do that. One of these days I'm planning to take these 3 drives down here, my X, Y, and Z drive, which I use for backup purposes, and make a big backup storage space. So I just haven't got around to it, and it would be fun to do. In fact, I should video that thing so that I have an example for you for classes like this. I just haven't done it yet, but it would be worth doing. We call it storage spaces can use just a bunch of disks. In other words, these disks can be any type of disk. They don't have to be one type of hard drive. Right? We could just pull them all together, and this, you know what? I don't believe that on client machines that the storage spaces actually does data deduplication. The idea of data deduplication is that if you have duplicated files or duplicated data, parts of files, that it can use mathematical calculations in order to only create one and then have pointers to the other one, so that you can have the data take up less space. However, I was doing some research one day on that, and I believe that on client machines you can't actually do that. I believe you have to have storage spaces direct to do it. I could be wrong on that. However, you do have flexibility in how you lay out these pools of storage spaces. Oops.